I know, I kept trying to cut parts of this story so that it would make sense, but it's hard to make sense of such a long story, and yet it always surprises me how many people don't really know anything about Abigail in the Bible, even though I think she has one of the most powerful stories, especially in the Old Testament. So as we begin today's sermon and message, I have to begin with a confession. Comes with a bang. My favorite word to say out loud is a bad word. I know, shocking. And I share this with you because recently I had a teenager share with me at camp that she loved to say swear words, but she thought maybe she should stop using them. And so I thought about this for a second. You know, when a teenager shares something like this with you, you don't want to just dismiss it. They're really trying to figure something on a different level out. So I told her that to say a swear word all the time is to waste its power when it's really needed. That ultimately, there are some words and some actions that if we make them commonplace, take away what makes them have real and powerful meaning. It's like playing a good card in a card game when your opponent has only played a 2 of clubs and clearly is not going to be able to win this part of the game. Swear words, like a lot of life's actions and phrases, should be used as ace cards, strategically placed in a way that expresses real emotions and thoughts in that moment. Because once you say things that are a little bit questionable, you can't take those burned bridges back. And you want to make sure that you're not burning bridges you will someday maybe need to get back across. And then you must make sure that your words and your actions are informed in a way that you're not just portraying what ultimately can look like unintentional ignorance. Today we are in a story where we must talk about power and unintentional ignorance. It is about playing the game. And each person in this story that we've heard has a card or two that they are able to play. There's a man who has all the money, Nabal. There's a man who has the promise and the anointing of being king. There's a woman, Abigail, who's described explicitly as having brains and beauty. And there's a guy who's been anointed the future king. Oh yeah. There's also another power play in this, God. And so all of a sudden we're looking at the same types of characters that are actually found in the series Game of Thrones. If you watch the series, there are those with money, those with crowns, those who have armies, those who have gods, the old gods and the new gods. And then in the Game of Thrones, the biggest difference than in this biblical story is there is a person with dragons. Nobody in this version has any dragons. But the question throughout this series and throughout the stories that we hear today is which one and which power strategically will win without dying first or losing everything. If you do watch the show Game of Thrones, you will end up knowing this man. His name is Tywin Lannister. And spoiler alert, this guy has all the money. And yet he did not make it to the end of the game. He trusted his money more than he trusted anything else. And his love of money and being seen as powerful, crude, and perfect, much like Nabal in today's story, led to his gruesome death. Nabal, Abigail's husband, also trusted his power, his money. He trusted those things much more than his need to be kind and giving and hospitable to the stranger. He only valued the rank of being master and did not know the importance of what it meant to be one who actually serves and welcomes. He only would serve someone if he knew who he was serving and why. He needed the details to make sure that that person was worthy in his judgment, and thus acted as a God does instead of trusting the judgment of God. He was frugal and inwardly focused in his own little world, and his ultimate comfort and need to feel secure ultimately led to his death. Much later, Jesus shared a very similar parable. A story reflects the story of Nabal, because Nabal's name means fool. There was a rich fool who stored his crops in the ways that showed his treasures were to be stored on this earth and not in heaven. St. Augustine talks about this fool in a way that says he was planning to fill his soul with excessive and unnecessary feasting, and was profoundly disregarding all those empty bellies of the poor. He did not realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms than barns. Because the poor do not yield any earthly power. They're not listed in the possible ace cards or king cards that might actually win the game. I mean, David, think about it, at this time in the story, has no crown. He has no home. At the very beginning of this chapter, Samuel, the one who anointed him, has died, so he has no one to vouch for him. And the only thing anybody knows is there's this king who continues to chase after him. And all he has at this moment is kindness to offer. And Nabal decides to reject that kindness. David understandably was not very happy about this. I would gather that he probably felt humiliated in an already discouraging situation. I mean, he had a few other people who were traveling with him, fighters. And so in this moment, when everything else just seems to be going against you, his response was to kill everyone, even those who were innocent bystanders. Reminds us in this moment that David is still human, emotionally distraught, frustrated, and still a young man who has many lessons to learn before he finally becomes king. But we find this story is crucial in David's history. This is the story right before. We heard it on last week's video a little bit about this story. This is the story right before David has the opportunity to easily kill Saul. But as we know from last week, David chose not to kill Saul and just take a piece of his cloak and let him live. This is the story right before that where David is given a choice. And while we know that David later on goes to be a pretty good king, at this point David's successes have ultimately only led him to being hated, hunted, and living as a refugee in fear for his life. I am sure for David there are some days when going back to the sheep and playing the harp sounds like a much better option than what all of a sudden he's been anointed and called into. The anointing has not been easy. People have died, like we heard last week, because they have given him just simple bread to eat. And he and his friends are still out in the woods, stuck and hungry. And this man, Nabal, has enough food. Why is he not willing to share? Fear? Ignorance? Power? David came peacefully forward into this land. He did not fight. He did not try to take. He simply went and asked. He just needed food. He even asked nicely. But once Nabal said no, David was done being nice. Kindness does not seem to be working in David's favor, or in the favor of those who support him. It is time he has decided to show his power. It is time for some revenge. The character in Game of Thrones, Jon Snow, actually reminds me a lot of David. the world has not also been so nice to him. Yet he keeps getting put in positions of power throughout the show. And at one point, when this starts to shift in the show, he meets a girl. Her name's Grit. He thinks that he has taken her prisoner, but little does he know that she will quickly be the one who has power over him. Much like Abigail in today's story, Grit is beautiful, smart, and even a little bit manipulative. She uses her good looks and her brash personality to change her situation as prisoner from being seen as less than to showing Jon Snow what it really means to be more than. Grit and Abigail both encounter boys who need to learn important truths about the world that they are being a part of and given power for. Both men think their fighting is justified in what they're doing, and yet both women show them that the battles they should really be fighting are not the petty ones of human insecurities, but instead the larger evils that hurt all humanity's ability to find peace, known through true high powers. So in this moment, as David faces Abigail, he could choose to be like Saul and fall in the task that God has given him and fail. Or he could choose a better choice. He could live a life that gives grace, forgiveness, and mercy. He can learn the importance of listening, stopping, thinking, and trusting God. He can learn that responding in anger to fools only makes one look, sound, and become foolish. He could play a power card when his enemy only is holding a 2. Those who fight so hard to protect their stuff from others do not really do it and understand what it means to have grace and forgiveness and mercy given to them. They do not know how to trust others. They do not know how to trust God. And when their stuff and their image is taken, their lives become nothing. They have never had to ask, and thus they have no way to receive. David was able to receive, and he received Abigail's wisdom. It may have helped him listen because she was attractive, but ultimately her cleverness is what taught him to see the world in a different way and to live in a way that reflects God's kingdom and not David's. And by doing this, it is interesting, David ends up marrying Abigail. Thus, not only did David get some food and crops and sheep of Nabal's, but he ended up getting everything that was Nabal's. Everything he had owned, including an area of land that was strategically placed in the middle of Judah as he moved towards the throne. So whether David married her because he was attracted to her or because of her mind or as an astute political move or both, no one really knows. But the change it made in David changed almost everything after this moment and his choices. And we will continue as we go through our Game of Thrones and 1st and 2nd Samuel to see where David confronts and sometimes fails in the challenges between living life as faithful to God or faithful to the wants of David. There will be times when David does play the wrong card and acts in haste and ignorance. Sometimes he will say a word or respond with an action that's power is not really portraying the power of God in a faithful way. He, like all of us, will burn bridges that he will not be able to rebuild, and he will play that wrong card. Yet we will find while David was a good king, the real king, who is able to faithfully follow God, we know never wore a crown of gold. He wore a crown of thorns. And while we seek to be ultimately like this Prince of Peace, we can realize that a lot of times we are probably going to be more like David. We will fail. We will say the wrong word or do the wrong action. And yet at times, God will send us people like Abigail's in our world to remind us the battles that are really important, the battles that include bringing food to the stranger, and even leading the foolish, those with ignorance, to ultimately suffer at the hands of our kindness, our grace, our goodness, our hospitality, and our love. Those cards and those words always win and always have power because they are God's.